Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We have two superb poets with us today, Maurya Simon and Paige James. Maurya will read first and then Paige. Maurya Simon has published 10 volumes of poetry, including The Wilderness, New and Selected Poems, 1980-2016, recipient of the 2019 Gold Medal in Poetry from the Independent Booksellers Association. Her new book, La Sirena, a novella in verse, is forthcoming in 2024. She's been the recipient of an NEA Fellowship in Poetry, as well as serving multiple visiting artist residencies at the MacDowell Colony and the American Academy in Rome. Her poems have been translated into Hebrew, French, Spanish, Greek, and Farsi. Simon taught literature and creative writing in the Department of Creative Writing at the University of California, Riverside for 30 years and serves currently as a professor emerita and a professor of the graduate division. She divides her time between San Clemente and the Angeles National Forest in the San Gabriel Mountains of Southern California. Here's an elegant and harmonious poet, Maurya Simon.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Harry. I really appreciate it. It's a pleasure to be here today. It's a pleasure to be reading with the terrific poet, Paige James. I look forward to hearing your reading, Paige, very much. And I'm actually, Harry, not going to be reading from La Sirena, which is the book coming out in 2024. I'm going to read from another book manuscript called The Blue Bridge. And I've actually never read from this book before, so I do hope it works out all right. And I'm going to start with a poem that I guess is a way of serving witness to what is going on in our world, which is that so many species are dying and climate change is wreaking havoc with mostly everyone's lives these days. And it's very hard not to be devastated by the fact that the earth is suffering and we're in dire times in many ways ecologically. So this poem is called Omnicide, which means, of course, the death of everything. So I will begin with a rather serious poem. Omnicide. And when our children ask, why did you do nothing as the world was dying? What will we tell them? Will we say, we didn't know how sick it was, or admit we gathered all our rosebuds while we could, old time was still a-flying? It's now the end of everything, our children will say. Go crawl into your arks and sail off destitute into your doom, and leave us only our shadows. And our kids will light candles across 7 continents, empty now of lions, kangaroos, ravens, pelicans, dromedaries, squirrels, devoid of praying mantises, koalas, ants, cobras, snails, Doberman pinschers, pigs, vultures, lizards, and alley cats. Our little ones will hide in caves with blind cockroaches, together feeding on the algae glowing in neon greens and blues across dolomite and limestone walls. They'll leave no pictographs behind, no sprayed handprints, no artful gods. Such silence now, they'll say, this you've bequeathed us, this human indifference, and we will beg them, survive. So yes, Halloween is on the horizon, as Perry mentioned before we went on the air. And so I am going to read a Halloween poem. And it is a persona poem or a dramatic monologue. And it's where I assume the voice of a zombie. So it's written in the voice of a zombie. It's called Saturday Night Fever. You're a better zombie than I am. The straggler says to me, as we thousands surge into a blockaded village, our wounds weeping, our chorus of groans rising steadily into a thunderous crescendo. That's because I'm hungrier, I confess to her. So ravenous, I'd eat a morgue full of skinny lap dancers. Grinning, we swarm the electric fencing, engulf the townsfolk who yelp like baby rabbits. The fallen lie still only for moments before they struggle into their newly made clumsy personas, looking like us now, hollow-eyed, weak, absurd, unstoppable. Every Saturday night, the apocalypse arrives anew atop our shoulders, I mutter to the slowpoke, whose mouth looks like the black hole of Calcutta. Can zombies fall in love? She asks sweetly, then spits out clumps of someone's scalp. Death has few rules, I admit, besides making us tragic anti-heroes who are mostly inept and immoral, or rather, I mean immortal. She giggles. A double whammy. We clasp hands as we lunge forward together, panting, hungry for life. When I was a kid, one summer, my family drove up to Sacramento and went to the state fair there. And I saw for the first time fireflies, which I thought were the most magical creatures I had ever seen. And I read recently that fireflies are dying out and are actually endangered. And it seems awfully sad to lose these amazing little creatures that light up the night. So I wrote an ode to fireflies, and this is my ode. Dark turns you on, triggering your sparks so that every male who flits and hovers above summer grass, each lucent ass dancing out an insect Morse code, beckons to a bevy of hither-coming lasses. Little flashy, brittle bugs, you become despair's antidote, bite-sized asterisks of hope, whose tiny beacons pulsate through the drifting zones of night, fueled by pheromones of fire. I bow to you, O little souvenirs of awe. What god or goddess conjured you from the abyss, set you ablaze with bioluminescent flashes, and scented you for sex? You've taught me how to wire an electric sizzle to a goodnight kiss. I guess, in reviewing this manuscript, I realized that so many of my poems written in the last 5 or 10 years are elegiac, that there's running through many of them this sense of loss of the natural world. And sometimes I'm not even aware of it, as in the firefly poem. It's a celebration of fireflies, but there's also the sense that I may not see them again. So here's another poem, kind of a philosophical one, called Post-Pleistocene Blues. And I subscribed to an archaeology magazine, and it had a story last year about an archaeological find in Nebraska, and in South Dakota, several finds in South Dakota of these amazing Columbian mammoths that had been, and in one area of, I think it was in South Dakota, there was a tower that was about 5 stories high of fossilized bones of these mammoths. So that article inspired this poem, Post-Pleistocene Blues. Cheetahs once wandered the jungles of Nebraska alongside other megafauna like short-faced bears and lumbering Columbian mammoths. Herds of these pachyderms waded into a vast lake in southeast Dakota's savannas and drowned after being sucked into quicksand mud. Over millennia, they fused into a many-storied high-rise of fossilized skulls, rib cages, and tusks. Though time's a finite resource, some species squander it, like us. I lived in South India, in Tamil Nadu, for a few years. And one time when I was there in the early 90s, I wrote an article for the New York Times, a travel article, which was a dream article because it entailed my and my daughters visiting several wildlife sanctuaries in the hill stations or in the hills of South India, the Nilgiris. And this is a poem called A Meditation about one of those trips to a wildlife sanctuary. Under clouds, white and frayed as old lace, on a narrow tree branch in a Nilgiri forest, I found a crested tree swift's nest ornamented with bark, feathers, flower petals, and butterflies pilfered mid-flight by those fork-tailed birds. One blue-gray egg was laid there, glued to its nest with swift spittle, surrounded by dead honeybees like amber beads decorating the nest's perimeter. The parent swifts were nowhere in sight, so I worried about a brain fever bird or raven ransacking the nest, then stealing or devouring that single egg laid so lovingly in its bower. I relived on another forest outing my tripping over a banded crate, that 7-step snake with its neurotoxic venom. All around me, roots erupted from the forest floor like cinnamon quills, and a gentle cacophony of sounds filtered through 10 million leaves, reminding me how alive I was and how fraught, how every breath was laden with the freight of being and nothingness. As were that solitary swift egg, its sculpted nest, the forest's deadly reptiles and poisonous webs, every living thing cradling its beginning and end in its genes. Awe filled me, and I turned away. It's hard not to think about war these days with the war going on in the Ukraine, that most tragic of conflicts. And I got to thinking about war in general and how really it's impossible to win a war. So this poem is about that conclusion. And I address a you, Y-O-U, in the poem, and that you is my husband, Robert. No wars are won because someone always dies who's innocent, and someone else accidentally kills his brother, and another soldier surrenders to a darkness so profound it blinds his regiment. Wars leave so much wreckage that even vultures feel overwhelmed. Scavenger dogs get glutted with remorse, and silent battle scars reappear in succeeding generations when grandchildren's nerve endings revisit their grandparents' war trauma. No wars are won when scorched battlefields lie fallow for decades, poisoned by toxins, when enemies pretend they're reconciled, when they're simply blinded by grief. My father's war made him feel lucky to be alive, though he never left the islands, Staten and Manhattan, and he despised the army. Your father's battles won him a Bronze Star, a Purple Heart, shrapnel in his back, and worse, PTSD that he's passed on to you, his son. Because your dad's kin were murdered by Nazis, his was a good war, he said. But I doubt it. For how can any war be won when everyone loses their moral compass or dies prematurely, clutching a ruptured life raft inside of them? I like to think that this next poem, with which I think I will end the reading, is both an elegy and an ode. It's called The Blue Bridge, and it's the title poem for another new book that's I hope will be coming out soon. And it's preceded by an epigraph by a Chumash elder. And the Chumash tribe was the tribe that inhabited coastal Southern California before Western settlers came. And the epigraph before the Blue Bridge is, "The most dangerous time is the most spiritual." The Blue Bridge. Heaving winds scatter stars across the sky, while below its light-pitted dome, tall cedars shiver, rattling parched branches. I stand in winter's darkness alone, between two chittering invisible wrens, and I hold a secret in my throat. Once a woman sailed upstairs to paint these constellations, my mother, with her black braid flying behind her, a kite's tail. I feel her floating down to earth slowly, landing softly beside me, where she sighs, "Oh, if only I could stay a while." It's fire season all year long now, and as these Santa Ana winds howl, the forest trees daven like 1,000 rabbis beseeching an erstwhile god. I want to shout these gales into oblivion or wrestle them into an abyss, then quickly shut its lid. In an eyelid's blink, a match put to these woods could cause a conflagration so vast it would smoke out the Milky Way, char our lives beyond recognition. We jeopardize nature, and it's fighting back. I used to think life always wins, but my mind is changed now. We've lost too much wilderness. Too many ghosts harangue us for abandoning them, for severing ourselves from nature. They return to warn us. And I also see a catwalk stretching out before us, a road to redemption. Its hue is otherworldly, tinged a rare morning glory blue. This sky-yearning bridge, this umbilicus, joins our sorrow to a splintered radiance. My brave mother knows its truth, and though dead, she travels silently back and forth, riding her zip line and tethered to hope, a taste of the afterlife wetting her tongue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maurya.
Thank you.
Such a magnificent reading. Your poetry has such clarity, sagaciousness, and radiance. You use the word radiance at the last part. And, you mentioned that elegy and an ode. I've often wondered, in our time, are all poems elegiac? I mean, we've seen so much and we've gone through so much. That's a rhetorical question, obviously, but let me ask you a few questions about yourself. When did you write your first poem?
I wrote my first poem when I was 5 and living in Paris with my family. And I saw a royal, I guess, or aristocratic wedding going down the Champs-Élysées. And it was, like a fairy tale of a coach with white horses and horsemen with epaulets and feathers in their caps, and a princess and a prince it looked like to me at 5. And I was so taken with that vision, like it had come out of a fairy tale book, that I wrote a poem, like a 4-line poem, hoping I could preserve that wonderful experience. And I think that was probably my impulse with writing poetry when I was young, was to try to preserve the most magical moments and most awe-inspiring moments in my life.
Well, from that story, it almost sounds like you've lived a storybook life. I mean, you have such a great life, a 5-year-old in Paris and the majesty. What is it about the poetry form that attracts you to it?
I think, my mother was an artist and a visual artist, and my father was a musician and composer. And I think I chose very early not to compete with them. And yet I realized that poems can incorporate the visual and the musical. So I think it was my way of trying to follow in their footsteps by synthesizing those two approaches, having very highly visual poetry, but also poetry that sings, that's lyrical. So yeah. I don't know if that answers your question or not, Harry.
No, it does. My late wife, Holly, if you read her poetry, she would usually start a poem with a visual, an image, and her poetry was, more like a bar talk, asymmetrical, but, she had her own rhythms, as each one of us do, or at least we hope to have our own singular rhythms that we put out there on the page. What do you, when you sit down to write a poem, do you start with an image, an idea, an emotion, a phrase? What is it that kicks off, that causes you to write a particular poem?
Different things. I think, having taught poetry writing for almost 30 years at UC Riverside, and I often gave my students prompts to write or assignments, write a poem for instance, that it employs anaphora, which is the repetition of the first word of every line, or the repetition of a phrase at the beginning of each line. And I would always do the assignments with them. And I think so sometimes it was that kind of almost a forced inspiration of, trying to meet some challenge that intellectual or artistic, verbal, whatever. And other times, like that poem I read about No Wars Are Won, it was about thinking about war. I mean, it was really a kind of a moral dilemma. Why do we still have wars? This is, and there is no way to win. You cannot win a war. You may win on paper, but there's so much loss that you've lost the war, even when you've won it, I suppose. So sometimes something I've been thinking about, sometimes a first line will just pop in my head. I don't know if you experience this too, but sometimes I wake up at 2 a.m. and suddenly I have a first line of a poem, and then I get up and I think, I really don't want to be up right now, but if I don't write it down, I won't remember it, work on it later. So poems come from different directions.
Well, I always say, take the time. Whenever it comes, you have to get up and write it down. Or as you say, it's gone. It's like photographing a flower. If you don't get it at that moment, it's changed.
That's right.
So, I understand exactly what you're talking about. MPTF, as you may know, is the Motion Picture and Television Fund. So if I may ask you a question not related to poetry, could you give us a couple, one or two of your favorite movies of all time?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, I think Apocalypse Now is up there. Probably The Wizard of Oz is up there. I love the Godfather films, despite all their violence and gore. There's an Indian director who did the Apu trilogy. I've just forgotten his name. They were done in the 50s, I think, or 60s, and they're in black and white, and they're very moving. So those are among my favorite films. How about you? What are your favorite films?
I could give it to you, Elizabeth, to stick back to you, for example, Satyajit Ray.
Satyajit Ray. Thank you. Yes.
at one point he was asked to do a short film. And if you ever want to turn it on YouTube, I think it's called, oh gosh, I forget, a boy. It was about a city boy and a country boy. And it's a like 8-minute long film. And it's really about America or the country, where the rich person just wants everybody to hear what he's talking about and destroys what the other country boy, his, kind of homemade way of making sounds. He doesn't have the money to all the great instruments that the rich boy does. And then finally the rich boy kind of drives him away because he keeps puncturing the country boy's efforts to make, make friendship and and give him what he can. But I would say just briefly, just 3 of my top films are number 1, Grand Illusion by Renoir, 1937. And one of his themes has always been brotherhood. And then the Adventures of Robin Hood with Errol Flynn around that time. And then finally, for the top 3, Citizen Kane. But I love movies, as you would imagine. You've had such an interesting life, and obviously I don't know it, but I would like to just ask you a question, since you're a teacher, for the last question. What would you tell a young woman who sits down to write her first poem? What would you tell her in terms of what she should focus on?
I think I would say yourself, your own life, because it's important. And I think I'd also tell her, don't give up, because it's too easy for women in particular, especially after they're married and have kids, to not continue. And I remember once, one of the teachers I had, a wonderful poet named Charles Wright, years after I had studied with him at UC Irvine, I had published a book and sent him a copy, and he wrote back saying that I was one of the few women students he had over a 40-year career of teaching who had continued with poetry. And he said that he felt it was tragic that so many women don't continue because of the demands their lives, and especially domestic demands, I think, or child-caring demands make on them. So I'd say stick with it. Your voice is valuable.
Well, that's the number 1 mantra in sports. Don't give up. You could be way behind and you got to keep trying. And also in terms of women poets, I mean, you think about how many we knew growing up. I'm 83, and maybe we could name 5 or 6 or 7, but today there's just so many great women poets of different ethnic groups. It's just really bounteous. But, I'm happy to have met you on Zoom, and you're a fabulous poet, and you just have such fluency and eloquence and erudition. So thank you for your wonderful poetry reading, Maurya Simon.
Thank you so much, Harry. Thank you to the listeners.
Perry Janes is a writer and filmmaker from Metro Detroit, Michigan. A recipient of the Pushcart Prize, his fiction and poetry has appeared in Poetry, Ziziva, Poem a Day, Subtropics, and many others. He earned his BA from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, where he was a 5-time recipient of the Hopwood Award, and his MFA in poetry from Warren Wilson College, a winner of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences Student Academy Award. He lives in Los Angeles, where he works as a screenwriter. His debut collection of poems, Find Me When You're Ready, is forthcoming from Curbstone Northwestern University Press in September 24. An imaginative and wonderful poet, Perry Janes.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, Maurya. Thank you for that beautiful reading. I'm just going to read a small handful of poems here today, but I did just want to say this is fun for me. This is a community that takes sort of my 2 working lives as both a screenwriter and a poet and sort of smashes them together. And so, yeah, being here is really a joy. And with that in mind, I'm actually going to start with a poem that is inspired by my experience working in the entertainment industry. Most of the poems I'm going to read today are from the forthcoming collection, Find Me When You're Ready. But this is actually a newer piece from a new manuscript, very much about working and living in Los Angeles. Here's the pitch. Pretend you had to sell it, this life you've been given. Thyroid goiter as scenic esophageal overlook. Hypertension as a live demonstration of the heart's amazing high volume pumping capacities. You must take up embroidering the truth with the same fervor debutantes once used to stitch needlework for bachelors. If nothing else, at least you'll possess one marketable skill. Take me, for example. I could offer you early morning anxiety attacks, or, if you prefer, passions that unfailingly rouse you from sleep into the horizon of opportunities cresting each new dawn. Necessity makes salesmen of us all. So your bathwater phosphoresces, so your sky wraps its smog fingers around the throats of sparrows, pigeons, starlings, to drop them on the sidewalk. Miracles by any other measure. What changes when the year of unemployment becomes the era of unlicensed afternoons from which the very milk of freedom is harvested for nourishment? Would you be more interested in planter's warts or flesh-made pearls, a friend's betrayal, or the dramatic unmasking of a villain that restores the currency of loyalty among companions? You've got to practice. You've got to sell it again and again and again and again. This is how you buy it back every time. You buy it back. Ars Poetica as love poem with autocorrect, or Mission You. We're far enough into the future. What I call nightlight might also mean the dozen or so screens that brighten my living room furniture. Far enough, what I mean by death might also be the slow replacement of my hands, the way they tremor when I laugh, by photos that live on a server somewhere in Arizona, each hard drive filled with theaters I rotate in the dark, smiling. I admit there are days I require language to make my body in the world feel real. Days I walk headlong into my words and find nothing I recognize there. Not the goose-like form of shoes stormed against the door. Not the shape of bed quilts left by morning's hurried departure. Shit, we're far enough into the future. There should be a word by now to say, I have unsubscribed from this email chain on 10 separate occasions, and now I am prepared to break my phone. A second word for the 1,001 times I have tried to unsubscribe from that feeling I sometimes get between my toes after a long run. Numbness, I'm silently terrified, means nerve damage. Or maybe we're far enough now from our bodies, our landscapes. We've lost lexicon to faithfully describe the ocotillo, how it sprouts from the desert like hair from the dead, how the desert stretches out and out until, finally, the distance between myself and the world no longer seems so strange. The idea of leaving it now, no stranger than the word abacus, meaning a beaded string scholars once used to tally up their days. Far, whatever. But maybe not so far, language can't still keep me. The surprise of my phone's corrective mind, how missing you becomes mission you, and there it is. Accuracy. The body I've waited for. Body, yours, I need. One small toe reaching farther than its neighbors, fat tumor blooming below the shoulder that I kiss to keep well loved and benign. You, magpie comedian, laughing in your mother's voice. You, houseplant empath gently misting their leaves. You, objective and journey, obstacle, reward. Our future blinks by, surprising and mundane, and look how far we've come, you and I, needing only the word our feet make as they walk side by side. This music. As a child, I had a tendency toward the chronic. Ear infections, outbursts, nightmares. Through 5 long years, I carouseled in and out of exam rooms, schoolyards. Through 2 more, I curled at the foot of my wireframe bed, closest to the open door and its offering of light. When my mother or father happened past to find me there, late or not so late, they would stop to sing me lullabies, wordless ditties I now know they must have forgotten the lyrics for. Eventually, I'd fall asleep, and when I woke hours later to find blood on my pillow, urine-wet sheets, the ritual recommenced. I never wondered what these intrusions meant for their own sleepless nights. If they whistled the same melody through 12-hour days and graveyard shifts into grocery bags knotted with discount produce, or phones left off the cradle to reject angry collectors if they ever tired of it, each evening ending with their hands cupped at my ears, where they hummed their off-key tune to soothe me back to sleep. Years later, in grade school, the gaunt-faced teacher already eyeing college admissions assigned us to write about a period of suffering or struggle in our lives. When I stood at the front of the class to recite what I'd written, even my teacher betrayed his surprise and something like satisfaction by my little efforts at lyric. Finally, I thought some use for it all and rushed home to perform for my parents, pleased at this music I believed I had made. This next poem is a newer piece. It's a longer piece. I haven't read it before, but it felt apt for today because it is very much about adjusting to life in Los Angeles after relocating from Metro Detroit. Survival Guide for Great Indoorsmen. In San Bernardino State Park, 6,000 feet above sea level, a place so remote no one would notice for weeks if I went casually, almost easily missing. I hitch a stoic smile to my face and hike the winter trail 10 paces out front. My friends, warm in their fleece-lined vests and laughter, allowing me to lead. When I see, in the snow, nearly the same size as my overlarge Timberland boots, a paw print. And because I'm not an alarmist, because I don't want to scream the word bear, because I can't bear to hear my own voice stripped high in the altitude, I shout, "Guys, I think I found something." In California, any hike is rife with risk of wildlife encounters. Mountain lion, brown bear, rattlesnake. Swimming is no better. To swim in the ocean is to re-enter the food chain. Tiger shark, great white shark, Portuguese man-o'-war, hammerhead shark, jellyfish, fishing trawlers whose nets, broken from their pulleys, float like invisible snares to hook unsuspecting paddlers, oil spills. You get the gist. I once heard a teacher refer to himself as a great indoorsman and have considered getting the words tattooed on my bicep ever since. It's fortunate for those like us, there are guides full of practical instructions for survival. In case of a mountain lion, get big. In case of a rattlesnake, stand still. In case of a bear, play dead. Unless the bear is startled, mating with cubs, unless the snake initiates the dance, unless the lion has decided at that particular hour, nothing is larger than hunger. I'm not saying my fear makes sense. I'm saying the bear you don't see is more terrifying than the bear you do. Or not. A bear like Niagara Falls lives up to its reputation for awe. Sometimes two truths coexist. Truth. I watched Grizzly Man in high school and dreamt for weeks afterward in the same key of two documentarians being eaten alive. Truth. It's peaceful in the mountains. I escape there as often as I can. In Los Angeles, solitude requires commitment. I cultivate my own ecosystem. I've learned to avoid my neighbors, the peering eyes of baristas, friendly though they may be. I remain confined to my apartment, my car, my littlest village of screens. Even here, what's wild presses in. In case of user Snowflake Killer 1980 cursing you by name in the comment section of some C-SPAN news clip posted to social media, block them. In case of a truck on the highway honking behind you, high beams flashing with ire, slow to let them pass. In case of a man at your door hawking flyers that gleefully proclaim the end of days, his fist banging, actually banging the screen for you to open already, accept the bitter sacrament of reality, carefully latch the deadlock, leave his howl to the roadside, some poor sedan perpetually stuck in idle. Unless the man decides right then to strike down all non-believers, unless the truck nudges your bumper, unless the fascist in the comments section doxes your address, sourced from public domain registries, to an e-blast of trolls, unless you no longer know where the threat is coming from. Spindrift cycle of menace, confusion of jeopardy. In San Bernardino State Park, the trees are all half burned, a memory of fire. Lamp black bark, charred, limbless, root to trunk, until green buds, bird nests, bear paw. Look how I call the imagined creature to my palm, how it shivers with pleasure, the way animals sometimes do, and walks beside me down the wintry trail, leaving only our single set of tracks behind. One more Los Angeles poem, and then I'm going to close with a poem that feels apt for the Zoom format, written during the COVID-19 pandemic. Nearly all my friends call me spoiled and ungrateful. But what do they know of endlessness? In Los Angeles, it is as though someone has copy-pasted the same morning over and over and over and over and over, 365 fucking mornings in a row. I wake to the same sun and stucco and slate blue sky. If sunlight is the best disinfectant, why do seasonal birds migrated for winter choose my patch of sidewalk to die on? There's no dignity in the corpse left lying to collect sand and Snickers wrappers in its feathers. Where I'm from, storm clouds and cold span entire seasons. Our sun is an incandescent bulb that does nothing to keep us warm. We smother its glow when we want to feel our shadows elastic. Here, I get tired just looking at the agave outside my window, how it holds its shape, how it's never allowed to wilt. Some days I draw the bathroom blinds and stand beneath my shower, pretending rain. But even I can't resist wandering outside again, passing again the turnstiles of my life, its sharp and spiteful gardens, my face craned up for a light that promises and promises and promises. The cookout after Jason Schinder. That's how it goes. The meal ends, all of us scraping the plates of our loneliness into the dishwater. I hug my friends goodnight. I don't take special notice of the way Priscilla's elbow clicks when it bends, how Bash's collarbone juts into my neck. I close the door behind them, and just like that, the virus. Just like that, months of video calls. I pray this email finds you in hopeful spirits. That's how it goes. What arrives, arrives suddenly. I disinfect the groceries. I sit on the toothsome couch. I blur days with days on television. It is a story with very little action. When I was still a boy, my parents would cruise around suburban streets, singling out houses we would never be able to afford. It didn't matter. I stretched my little legs across the car seat like a couch, made a TV of my Game Boy. I bay-windowed the moonroof. I pitied the others, those kids with backyard swimming pools and au pairs who didn't know this augury, this homing the night, our own. Today, I cul-de-sac the sugar packets strewn on my dining table. I stretched the Afghan above the bed, its threadbare blue skying with lamplight. Friends, I imagine the cookout we'll have here. I roof my hands, I picket my teeth, I lawn the tongue for any who need to rest. Come through, bring the beer, Mike. Will, help yourself to the barbecue. Tom, Jake, you're in charge of margaritas. Quit asking, Kevin. Of course you can bring the dog. Come in, Sam. Come in, Fatih. Hugh, goddamn, let me try on those glasses. Andres, put the little ones on the carpet. Dries is here with Cynthia. There by the hearth, Marijane nursing her mug of cocoa, having found unlikely companions in Chris and Gina. Listen to them, yammering about the news. Tina, darling, you know these halls better than any. Crank up the speakers, never mind the neighbors. V, I've saved a blanket special for your shoulders. Tell Matthew he doesn't have to worry. Stop tidying the counter, Van. Brandon, you too. My parents will be here any moment. Dan's on his way. Are you surprised he forgot the time? I have to name them, you understand. I have to name them to understand they're here. That's how it goes. We home whatever we have, even the body, especially the body. And although it is already sundown in the world of this poem, although the doors are opening, the guests again making excuses, streaming into a dark I am no longer certain we will ever step out from. Here are their dishes. Here is the water, dirty with signs of their living. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Perry. You know, you have such strength of narrative. There's a restlessness in your seeking too, and your superlative use of language, and you know, there's also love and empathy, obviously, in your work. When did you write your first poem?
Yeah, so I wrote my first poem when I was very young, when I was in middle school, about 7th grade. I spent a lot of time in bookstores. I often say I was partially raised by the public library, and I discovered two poets at more or less the same time, Maya Angelou and Pablo Neruda, and just found a kinship in the form and in that mode of expression. But I often say that I didn't become serious about writing poetry. I didn't write my first poem with the kind of level of intention, you know, that I bring to it now until I was an undergraduate in college. And I began working with the poet Vivi Francis in Detroit as a kind of mentor at that time. And that really put me on the path for what it would mean to live an artist life, I guess.
What is it about the poetry form that attracts you to it?
It's a good question. I sort of knew that this was going to be a question. And so I was going through like the index of some of my favorite quotes and truisms about poetry. And I rediscovered an old interview with the poet Ilya Kaminsky. And of course, now I'm blanking on where it's from, but he referred to poetry as being special because it speaks privately to thousands of people at the same time, more or less, right? And that really resonates with me. Poetry is a form of kind of private expression, as kind of a vehicle for that innermost monologue or voice, and occasionally hyper-narrative, but occasionally non-narrative, associative, right? Lyrical, sort of abstracted from the ordinary constraints of discursive language. I think that space, which is scary, is also freeing, and that is what's always really brought me to poetry.
And are those the two literary influences, the two that you mentioned, Maya Angelou and Neruda? Or are there others?
You know, I have to claim them because without them, I wouldn't be here. I think that I discovered my love of poetry through them. I'm not sure that I think of them as being explicitly in my lineage as a poet. I think that a poet that I got really excited about when I was really young and who has sort of stayed as a formative influence on me and my work over time is the poet Linda Hull. I feel like Linda Hull, who died too young, was a poet who really fused this sort of hyper imagistic and hyper narrative mode of poetry. It's often referred to as being very film noir, which sort of, I guess, feels apt, right, for this space. But her poetry was also tremendously lyric and interested in intellectual thought and, sort of digging beneath the veneers of narrative. And I think that she was able to kind of hold all of those things together in her work. And so I guess if I were kind of pointing to a poet that really has inspired me and that I feel like I've learned a lot from again and again over the years, it would be Hull.
Maurya, why don't you turn on your visual and audio and you and Perry can talk a little bit. I want to ask Perry one more question, and then after that, why don't each one of you, say something about the other's work?
Sure.
Same question I asked Maurya. What are 2 or 3 of your favorite movies? Since this is a movie active senior retirement home, and this is LA.
Totally. Yeah, absolutely. This one's easy. Slash, I could probably spend 10 minutes answering it because, on any given day, what is my favorite film is going to rotate. But the film that is definitely a North Star for me is Pan's Labyrinth by Guillermo del Toro. The closest thing that I have to like an artistic manifesto or credo is this quote by A.R. Ammons in his poem Play, where he says, "Cue up, and if you like, drill imagination right through necessity." And that idea of drilling imagination through necessity, I feel like Pan's Labyrinth is sort of the perfect expression of what that looks like, right? To kind of hold the whimsicality and I guess the innocence, but also the playfulness of youthful imagination and also the difficulty and the rigors and the hardships of an adult world together. That I think is really exciting to me in art across forms and mediums. And so Pan's Labyrinth sort of becomes that, that lodestar for me.
Well, one picture that I've loved, it's in my top 10, is La Talente by Jean Vigo in 1934, the only feature he made. But the show's really about you two. So, Maurya, why don't you say a few words about Perry's work and then vice versa?
Well, I really like its how much you encompass of the world and bring it to the self. There's a sense of bringing the world in and owning it in a very personal way. Whether it's I love the poem about the hike in the San Gabriel Mountains. In the San Bernardino Mountains. I live in the San Gabriel Mountains, and I know about bears and mountain lions and rattlesnakes. And it's like, yes, you're right. It's scary going for a hike, but it's also quite amazing, right? And that sense of solitude that you find there is quite wonderful. And the ocean and the dangers of swimming in the ocean, quite wonderful. But I do like also the interiority of your poems, that there is such a kind of, and not just the last poem you read that I don't know if you wrote it during COVID-19, it feels like you did, but that sense of seclusion, entrapment, yearning for other people, and then imagining the other people being there and how deeply we're connected. I think all of your poems, there's a sense of being deeply connected to the world and to other people. And yet there's this wonderful, as I said, interior, this wonderful sense of kind of exploring the self and what it means to live in the world. So
thank you so much.
I think your work's terrific. Yeah.
I appreciate you saying that because...
And I love that you write about LA, and almost as an outsider, even though clearly you've lived in LA for a while, but you bring a different kind of attitude and observation as someone who didn't grow up in LA. And yet you're so spot on, I think, with your sense of LA. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I often feel like I have double vision living in LA because I feel like I can't claim LA and LA doesn't necessarily claim me, but also I go back to Detroit and all my friends call me Hollywood. And so, it's just, it's a house divided. Yeah. Thank you so much for those kind words about my work. It means a lot because I also am an admirer of your work. I was thrilled to see that we'd be reading together. And, it's funny, Harry earlier referred to me or my work as restless, which is, I laugh because it's been a word that I've been thinking so much about recently because it is so true. You may be able to tell I have kind of a restless energy about me, right? But in my work as well, I think that the associative leaping on the page, the leaping from form to form, genre to genre. And one thing that I really loved about the poems that you read and about your work in general is actually this profound capacity for stillness and to hold a single thing in your gaze, right? And to really honor it and sort of elevate it and infuse it with its own kind of interiority, right? There's a externalization of what I think of as kind of a human interiority onto the world in the poems you read and in your work. I know we spoke already about them being elegiac and the selection today certainly was. And I think that makes sense because that particular sort of rhetorical and imaginative and intellectual movement in your work really lends itself to that, right? If we're going to be eulogizing something passing from the world, right, then it's sort of the ultimate honor and form of empathy to behold it for an extended period of time, right? And to give it that kind of honor its interiority, honor its existence in the world. And so that stillness, which certainly is something that I think I would say I strive for, but rarely capture, is something I really, really loved and admired in your work. And it just felt like a breath, it brought that space to the poems. I really like that.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Both of you have just really transcended the daily, and you've lifted us up, and I deeply appreciate your wonderful work. And so we've come to the end of this show, and I just want to announce next week, the Marvelous Readers, they all live here at MPTF. They're actors. One will make her first appearance. She's an animator, but the wonderful readers are Corinne Conley. She worked as an actress for 70 years. Helen Richmond, Kay Wiseman, also wonderful actors. And Ruth Elliott, an animator, will read from the sonnets by William Shakespeare. So thank you both very much. And here's our leader, Jennifer Clymer.
I, again, so appreciate this hour every week. It gives us an opportunity to be together, to celebrate language. And Perry, for me, it was all about the meter. It was all about that ribbon that you gave us. So, yeah, thank you. And hopefully we see you guys back again here soon.
Thank you.
Would love to. Thank you for having us.